Welcome again to this Think Tank Conversations episode. At this time, we have the pleasure of having Thomas Gomart, director at the French Institute of International Relations, and also we have our Secretary General, Francisco de Santibañes. Francisco?
Thank you, Thomas, for being with us today. We met with Thomas a few years ago in one of the meetings of the Council of Councils that both CARI and IFRI are part. And since then, we have having these conversations about what's happening in the world, no? From the perspective of Europe and also from Argentina. Thomas is not only a director of IFRI, but the writer of many books, important books. I have here the last one. I highly recommend it. So to start, Thomas, maybe a good way is to introduce some of the ideas we are debating in many think tanks, no? Especially in the middle-sized countries. And there is a consensus that the world is changing, that we are moving from a liberal orders towards something new. And one of the realities, of the new realities, is that there are two big powers, Russia and China, that are in the middle of strategic competition. And of course, that affects the interests of the European states and South American states. Actually, at this time, we are having a discussion within many countries in our region about what technology to adopt, the 5G of the US, of China, how to react to what should be our position in relation to regional integration, some of the organizations that have to lead that process. So my question is, what's your view from a European perspective about what should we do, middle-sized countries facing this new reality?
Well, thank you very much, Francisco and Florencia, for your invitation. It's a great pleasure to have this discussion. Technology is very positive in such circumstances, just to have the ability to interact despite the difficulties we are all facing is something positive in my view. Even if obviously I will be very glad to have this discussion when you are in Paris or when I am in Buenos Aires, and I hope quite shortly. Francisco, you raised so many questions, so I will start with your idea of new reality, and especially seated in Paris, and to try to have a response based on my personal interpretation of the situation in Europe. Of course, it should be nuanced, but I should try to respond quickly to your question. For me, the COVID-19 is a sort of techno-sanitary crisis. It means that its roots are related to the disease, to the pandemics, but its main consequences are technological. And what is important to me, it is the situation in which Europe is facing a sort of technological blitzkrieg. I am referring to the wording of William Barr, the US General Attorney, who used these two words before the COVID in last February to explain that to some extent Europe has become the field of the technological competition between the US and China. And I do think that the crisis is accelerating this trend. You referred, Francisco, to 5G. It is fascinating to observe how 5G has become very quickly, with the COVID, hot political topic, especially in France. For instance, you had during the last week some very prominent political figures who intervene for the first time on the 5G, similar to what we observed, in the UK before summer, and maybe before what we observe in Germany in the coming weeks. So the analysis or the problem is framed as follows. Should we avoid this technology? For instance, you have many green politicians explaining that it should be delayed given the uncertainties about its implications. And you are the ones who do think that it's absolutely crucial for Europe to adapt 5G as quick as possible to stay in the competition and to avoid to be between, to some extent, China and the US. So what is the new reality? It is, I think, two trends. The first one related to what I have just said regarding 5G. It is the technological propagation, and refer also to the situation in Argentina. We are all facing this propagation, and the simultaneous, I would say, environmental degradation. We are all also facing these new constraints. And I think that this tension is a new reality for all of us, but with different implications depending on your positioning. So for Europe, for instance, if you observe the dynamic political forces in the new European Parliament, for sure there is the Greens. And for sure, Europe is investing in a sort of new Green Deal. Question is it possible to have only this part of the picture, to invest massively, significantly on energy transition without taking into consideration the technological propagation and its implication in pure security terms? And I think that with the new Commission, we are approaching a new phase in which the security implication of the technological propagation is increasingly taking into consideration by the European authorities. So I stop there to respond to your initial question.
Thank you, Thomas. Moving now to other of your areas of expertise, that's Russia. One thing that seems fascinating to me is the discussion about how important is the role of Putin in the formulation of foreign policy in Russia. No? So we will have a very different foreign policy without Putin, and more importantly, without Putin in the future, Russia foreign policy can be different than the present one, or we can think in realist terms that basically Russia is acting as a rational state in the international scenario. Or on the other hand, there is an important factor there, that's the personality of one leader.
I will try to sum up my views on that. First, I think it's important, seated in Argentina or in Europe, to understand that for Russia, the strategic obsession remains the US. What is highly important for the Russian authorities is to observe, I would say, their coming back on the international scene in the importance given to Russia by the US. In addition to that, we had a lot of interaction. Some elements of the wording is irrelevant because they don't want to use it, but some sort of alliance between Russia and China. The third point, speaking to Europeans, since I would say, yes, to some extent 2012, Russia presents itself as one of the three summits of the strategic triangle between the US, China, and Russia. Just to say, there is a sort of directoire at the global level, which is led by these three countries. Problem is the divergence or the gap between this level of strategic ambition and the means of Russia. In strategic terms, Russia continues to be, with the US, the main nuclear power. I remind that 95% of the global nuclear arsenal belongs to the US and Russia. In strategic terms, Russia during the last decade was agile in Ukraine, in Syria, to some extent in Libya, in Eastern Mediterranean, which was something maybe unexpected, especially by Europeans. And in strategic terms, Russia does believe that it has the possibility to defend a sort of strategic solitude. Very often, our Russian colleagues explain to us that we are no more, as Europeans, able to make decisions by ourselves given our alliance with the US. For Russia, it remains critical to keep this ability, which is more and more challenged by the increasing symmetry between China and Russia in economic terms, in trade terms, but more and more also in military terms. So now, for your question focused on Vladimir Vladimirovich, two things. The first one is the civil-military relations in Russia. It is something we observed very carefully because it is the basis initially of Putin's power when he succeeded to Boris Yeltsin. In fact, I have no time to remind everything, but just to remind that he started his first term with two things: the loss of a nuclear submarine, the Kursk, and he gave the possibility to the military to have a revenge in Chechnya. So if you observe his regime, it's very related to limited war. You have Chechnya, which is within the Russian Federation. You had in 2008 Georgia. You had in 2014 annexation of Crimea and destabilization in Donbass. And the year after, you have the intervention in Syria. Plus many manifestations of, I would say, strategic agility, either in North Atlantic or in North Africa, for instance. So it's just to say that Russia is using its military tool to exert a regional/global influence. In addition to that, as a UN permanent member, it used its veto rights many times regarding Syria, which explain also maybe why the Security Council is so blocked on many issues. Final point for Vladimir Vladimirovich, it was maybe not very visible because of COVID, but as you certainly know, he made a change in the Russian constitution by the beginning of 2020 to have the possibility to run until 2036. So it's just to say that we are facing a leader by comparison with European leaders, which is thinking in terms of one generation. He's already, one generation at the helm, and does want to continue apparently.
Perfect, Thomas. So my last question has to do with the role of IFRI, and if you want, think tanks in general, in the decision-making process of foreign policy in France, because as you have wrote, the tradition in France is different than in the UK or the United States, and even in Argentina, where we have many think tanks, in terms that decisions have traditionally been made within the state. Is that changing with IFRI and new think tanks?
Well, it's a tricky question. First of all, last year, IFRI celebrated its 40th anniversary. IFRI was founded by Thierry de Montbrial in 1979. So this context is very important because this year, 1979, was certainly a turning point, Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, revolution in Iran, situation in Saudi Arabia, openness of China. So I can elaborate on that. It's important because I think that for the think tanks, just the ability to analyze properly the current context is one of our duty. And I think that's what is very important in the current context, so 40 years after, is to be able to have an interpretation of what is going on with China, with the US, with Russia, with African countries, in the Middle East, with technologies and so on. And that's a collective challenge, for all the think tanks, because we are now belonging to this, I would say, global industry. And I think that we should act as platforms to interact as we do today, but also with some Chinese colleagues, with some American colleagues, Russian colleagues, and so on. And I think that when the situation is so tensed, between countries or administration, think tankers should continue to exchange between them. So that's the very first point. The second one, it's just to follow up on what you have said. You're absolutely right. You have a huge difference of political and administrative cultures in France by comparison with Germany, the UK, to say nothing about the US. And as I said, IFRI celebrated its 40th anniversary when Chatham House is celebrating its centenary this year. So it's just reflecting, that what was before IFRI, its name was CEPE, Centre d'études et de politique étrangère, was created in 1936. That means, 15 years after Chatham House. And this center was closed during the German occupation and was reopened after the war. And the creation of IFRI on this basis is explaining, that we are not at the same tempo to some extent. The third point is your question: are we involved with the decision making, the making decision process? Sorry, on that, I am very careful because many think tanks explain all the time that they are influential. Having been, trained as an historian, having been worked, in archives, I'm very skeptical about, this idea. I am very influential on the making decision process. I think it's something so complicated, so complex, especially right now, that you can be only influential on one segment, on one sequence, of this process. So to respond directly to your question, yes, we interact on a consistent manner with the French authorities and with the European authorities on different topics. Are we influential? I don't know, because I do know that they interact with others. But what has changed, certainly, in addition to that, it is the deep and regular interaction that we have with companies. And I think that now the positioning of IFRI is much more, and on that it is unique in Paris, this interface between the ability to interact with the public authorities and with the private sector.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for having time for us. And thank you, Francisco. And please see us again here at CARI Think Tanks Conversations.